How to anchor, a comprehensive anchoring guide. We'll look at different types of anchor, how much anchor chain to use, and how much anchor rope to use for a combined rope and chain system. Don't do this, there's some bad advice going around about making your anchor releasable. I'll show you why it's risky and how to rig up an anchor release system properly.
So when it comes to anchoring, there's three parts. One is the anchor itself. This is what digs into the floor. There's different types of anchor and different weights, and we'll look at those in a moment. We've also got chain, and we've also got the rope or the warp. On small boats, generally you tend to have some amount of chain and quite a lot of rope because it's easier and it's lighter to store in the boat. On a large boat, such as a yacht or a motor cruiser, you need a lot more chain for a bigger boat, so it gets really heavy. So you'll often then have a windlass, which is basically a winch that's designed specifically to work with a chain. So on that kind of boat, you then tend to have an all chain system because you don't then have to pull up the anchor by hand. So here we've got 5 different types of anchor. There are a lot more available, but these are quite well suited for small boats because particularly these types here are folding anchors. Okay, so designed to be easy to store, which is typical for use in a dinghy or a small powerboat. If you're on a yacht or a motor cruiser, you'll have a bow roller, so this kind of fixed type of anchor can sit off front and it's not in the way. So these 2 anchors here are Fluke anchors, sometimes also referred to as Danforth anchors because Danforth is one of the main manufacturers of this type of anchor. So the 2 Flukes dig down into the seabed, but when they're being stored they actually fold flat so they can tuck away neatly in the boat. So here, these 2 are Grapnel anchors. So again, they fold flat, these fingers fold in, and then they open out. So again, a design that they'll stow away inside the boat, but then you open them out, and then these dig into the seabed. These are particularly good for rocky bottoms because they don't actually have that much surface area in terms of digging into soft mud and sand. So anchors are measured by weight. So this Grapnel anchor is 8 kilos, this Plough anchor is 5 pounds, and then this Bruce anchor is 5 kilos. So to compare the two, these 2 anchors are both the same weight. You can see that the Fluke anchor is moving a lot more sand and digging in a lot more into the beach. Therefore, it will have a stronger hold in a sandy bottom and also things like mud. The Grapnel anchor works best as a grappling hook to grab onto rocky edges, so it's likely to perform better on a rocky bottom where other anchor types may not dig into the seabed properly. So just bear in mind that even though the anchors might be the same weight as each other, they've got different characteristics of how they hold in the seabed. So this is a Plough anchor, sometimes called a CQR, and it's literally like the kind of plough you imagine going through a field. So it's got weight at the tip here to help it dig itself into the seabed, and it'll bury itself down into the seabed. Just bear in mind with this kind of anchor, if the pull gets a bit too strong, it doesn't really keep digging itself down, it just then starts ploughing a trench through the seabed, perhaps until it finds a rockier or more firm bottom to get hold of again. This one here is a Bruce anchor, so it's designed that as it gets pulled along the bottom, it'll dig itself into the floor. So this is good for mud and sand, and for the same kind of weight, again, just like the Grapnel and the Fluke anchor, this will hold a lot better in mud and sand than something like an equivalent size Grapnel, just because this has got a much more surface area that's digging into the mud. So this is a fisherman's anchor, or a Popeye style anchor, that you get on your tattoo. So there's actually very little surface area here at all. So in terms of digging into a sandy or rocky bottom, it would be pretty useless. But it's designed that, on a rocky bottom where these like fingers can actually dig in and grab onto the edges of some rocks, then it's probably okay for that. But you don't see them now. So how much anchor chain do you need for your boat? Well, basically, more chain is more weight on the bottom, which is going to help to hold the anchor better, partly because we're just adding more weight, which is going to be physically heavier and harder to pull. But also, it's to do with a catenary curve, which is as the boat pulls backwards, the chain is pulling down in the middle here, and this is adding some shock absorbing to the boat bouncing around on the waves. And we're also trying to keep the shank of the anchor, that's a bit the chain attaches to, trying to keep the shank of the anchor low down to make sure the anchor is holding properly in the seabed. So how long should your anchor chain be? Well, there's different guidance, but it's all kind of quite similar for small boats. So some common guidance is to go for 10 to 15 feet, or at least sort of 2 to 4 meters worth of chain, or go for the length of your boat. So in this case, these two boats I've got out here, the chain that we use is the same length as the boats themselves, and they're both within that 10 to 15 feet range. Chain itself though comes in different shapes and sizes, so whilst we might have a certain length that we know we might need for our boat, just bear in mind that obviously the thicker the chain is, the heavier it's going to be, and that's going to be more effective at staying on the floor when the pull from the boat is upwards. Even two chains like this have the same diameter chain, but this long link chain is going to weigh a lot less because there's a lot less material in the same length of chain. So here we've got about 14 feet of chain for this 5.5 meter rib, and that's always been adequate, even anchoring out in some quite windy conditions. So the chain itself is probably quite kind of oversized for this size of boat, and the same with the anchor. We've got a grapnel anchor because that's what folds away most easily in the anchor locker in the bow of a boat to prevent damage whilst it's bouncing around. But we've gone for a kind of an oversized system to give additional holding because this is a rescue boat and a teaching boat, and sometimes we might be anchoring several boats which are tied alongside us or behind us. On that note, we have a length of warp, and then I see we've got a buoy attached, and what that means is if we need to, we can release the anchor very quickly into the water, drive around the boat, and then come back to recover the anchor at a later stage. As far as the practicalities go, more chain is going to be more weight in the water. It's going to help with that catenary curve to keep the anchor set properly, and it's going to provide more reliable holding. But bear in mind, if you're in a small boat like one of these, then you're going to be pulling the anchor in and out by hand most likely. So it needs to be manageable, that somebody is physically able to pull the anchor chain up and down out of the bottom. So it's all a compromise between having a really good holding of your anchor and what fits in the boat and what's manageable for you to deal with. So that's the anchor chain, but in terms of the warp, how much warp we need, well, that very much depends on the depth of the water that you're going to be anchoring into. So the chain has got to lay across the bottom, and then we've got to bear in mind the warp's going to be coming off at quite a shallow angle towards the bow of a boat on the surface. So we need enough warp for the amount of depth that we're going to be in. So we'll have a look at that now.
The warp will be almost weightless in the water, so when taut it'll be a straight line between the boat and the anchor chain. The intention here is to keep the pull on the chain at a shallow angle to help it to stay on the seabed under its own weight. You can see here that as we let more warp out, the angle gets smaller, so there's less upwards pull on the chain. The road is the combination of the warp and chain, or just chain if you have got an all chain system. The scope is the ratio of the length of the anchor rode to the depth of the water. Common guidance is that the total anchor rode should be 6 times the depth of the water, so the scope is 6 to 1.
So in 10 meters of depth, you'll need 60 meters combined warp and chain. You should also allow for any increase in tidal height when working out how much anchor rode to pay out, and also allow for the height of a bow where the anchor rode leaves the boat above the water. The strength of the wind and any current, as well as the size and type of boat, will all affect the amount of pull on the anchor. In light conditions, you may not need as much rode. In stronger conditions, you might need more. Here we can see how the length of the warp affects the angle that it will pull on the chain, not including the chain in the lengths here. As we let 2, 3, 4, then 6 times the amount of depth out, the angle of the warp to the seabed is reducing pretty quickly. It gets to a point though where we're letting out a lot of warp and not really reducing the angle of pull on the anchor chain very much. If the anchor isn't holding at this point, the chances are that the problem is actually that the anchor type or size, or the length or weight of the chain, are not sufficient to hold against the forces on the boat. With an all-chain anchor setup, it's a bit different, and again, there is a range of different guidance. Because the chain is a lot heavier than warp, it sits differently in the water. When we lay the anchor, the chain will fall more steeply away from a boat, following a catenary curve until it meets the seabed. The intention is to pay out enough chain that there is plenty of chain laying flat along the seabed, like this. As the strength of the wind or current increases, the tension on the anchor chain also increases and will pull the chain into a flatter curve. You can see here that some of the chain has now been lifted off the seabed, which is going to compromise the holding of the anchor. The solution is to let out more chain to increase the amount of chain between the anchor and the point where the chain meets the seabed. So, how much anchor chain to use depends on the conditions and the type of boat. Different guidance ranges from using a 4:1 scope to a 7:1 scope, with some even suggesting a 3:1 scope in a busy anchorage. However, a depth multiplier is a little too simplistic and has a few problems. In shallow water, a 3 or 4:1 scope doesn't leave much chain on the seabed. In deep water, few boats will carry enough chain to be able to anchor, especially if you're working to a 7:1 scope. So what we really need is a length of chain on the seabed, then an approximation for the length of chain involved in the curve. 15 meters of chain plus 2 times the depth seems to be a common recommendation by experienced boaters. We can see it more closely resembles the shape of a curve than just multiplying the depth. It means that in shallow water, there's still a decent amount of chain on the seabed, and in deep water that you don't need an impossible amount of chain. In strong winds and tides, letting more chain out will ensure there's still a suitable amount of chain on the seabed and the anchor isn't being pulled upwards. So before we anchor, we need to make sure that the anchor rode, that's the chain and the warp, is going to pay out properly without getting tangled. So it needs to be flaked into the anchor locker, or if you're in a small boat that doesn't have one, you might have some kind of plastic tub. So we make sure it doesn't want to be coiled up, it wants to be just paid in to the locker in reverse order of how it's going to come out. Now when you recover the anchor and put the warp straight into the anchor locker, that's going to happen naturally anyway. We also need to make sure the anchor is attached to the boat, which sounds really obvious, but I've seen several occasions of people just throwing an anchor in and not being able to hold on to the end of the line and losing the anchor in the water. Or make sure at least you've got a buoy on it so you don't lose the whole thing. So on this one, because it's designed to be released quickly, we just kind of attach it with a carabiner onto the bow. Now that doesn't actually really get used when we anchor. I'll show you why in a bit. And then all of the rest of the
Road.
just pay it into the locker so that the anchor is going to sit on top. The chain will hold the warp down. And then see here, this anchor stows away very nicely, and that's why we've got a grapnel in this boat, because something like a Bruce, it's a big fixed anchor, isn't going to fit in the locker very well. So that is ready to be paid out when we want to go. Let's go and do it. The boat's going to finish up facing into the tide or the wind, whichever's strongest. So we actually want to reverse the boat away from the anchor to help the boat face the right direction, and then we're going to lay the anchor off the bow of the boat. So I'm actually just going to start reversing away from the wind now. Now the wind here is always going to catch the bow more than the stern, so it might try and blow the boat, so it's not always pointing into the wind. So I'm just getting a little bit of backwards movement into the boat. Now because I'm by myself, I'm going to turn the engine off, take my kill cord off. That's why I've turned the engine off. So now I can come forwards to lay the anchor out. You can see the bow is actually drifting slightly sideways to the wind. Open up the anchor, and I'm just going to start laying it out. And I'm just trying not to drag it over the side of the boat. And the benefit of doing it by hand is partly we need the anchor chain to lay nicely across the floor. Don't just chuck it out the side of the boat, because if the chain kind of tangles up with the anchor, it might not lay properly. Okay, here's one I filmed earlier. So the benefit of laying it out by hand is we can feel when the anchor reaches the seabed. So if you haven't got a depth sounder, if you're in a small boat or a dinghy, then this is the best way really to work out how deep it is. Because when the anchor reaches the seabed, you can estimate roughly how much we've actually paid out. I'm paying it out nice and slowly now. I can feel the chain is now all on the bottom because the warp's now gone really light. So now it's just a case that the boat's drifting downwind, and I'm just paying it out to keep up with the pace of the drift of the boat. So every so often I'm just stopping the warp going out, and then you can see that's rotating the boat towards the wind again. Now I'm happy that I've paid out enough warp here. We've got a big anchor, a big heavy chain, and it's not very deep. And looking forwards, can you see the angle of the warp now? That's going forwards from the boat very nicely. Yeah, if it was going quite steeply downwards, then we need to lay more out. So going back to my diagram earlier, if we're kind of 6 times the depth, the anchor line's really going to be going forwards out of the boat. It's about sort of 10 to 15 degrees. So what I'm going to do now, so we don't really want the anchor warp going over the side of the boat. Now some ribs do have a big rubber fairlead on the bow here that the warp will sit in to hold the rope and protect the tubes. But also, just bear in mind, the load on the line is also compressing the tube. So a better way to do it as well, if we just make a loop in the anchor warp, so that's just a double figure of 8, and the painter, which attaches on at the bow, I'm just going to tie a bowl in. So we've joined the anchor warp to the painter, which is attached on the eye right on the bow of the hull itself. So if we pay that out and then leave the anchor warp here fairly slack, then the load's going to be taken by the anchor through the strong point on the bow. Okay, so now we've drifted backwards, and I can see over the bow, I can see that the painter has now come tight. So all we want to do here is just make sure there's not an excessive amount of slack rope in the water.
On a larger boat like this one, you're more likely to know the depth from a chart plotter or a depth sounder. When you're using a windlass, it's a good idea to mark the anchor chain with paint. Use a system of different colours or stripes so you know how much you've paid out. Here we've let out 50 feet of chain and a further 20 metres of warp. See, the warp is also marked. A windlass shouldn't hold the entire load of a boat while it's anchored. They can fail. Here we tie a prusik onto the anchor warp so we can connect a bridle to transfer the load onto the boat's cleats. When the anchor's down, you can help it to dig into the seabed by using a bit of reverse power. Then we need to check its holding.
So there's at least 5 ways to check that we're holding position and the anchor isn't dragging. So firstly, we can hold the anchor warp itself that's going off the boat, and if the anchor's dragging across the bottom, you can feel the vibration of the anchor dragging across the seabed coming up the warp. Second, we can use the GPS, partly to see if our position's staying stable, but more simply, it might just tell us we're traveling at 0.1 or 0.2 of a knot, on the screen if we're actually moving significantly. We're going to drift about a little bit. Now, some phones, you can get an app, or on some GPS units, we can actually set an anchor alarm, so it draws a radius around the boat of how far we're expecting to drift. And once we get outside of that area, it'll set an alarm off. So that's particularly useful if you're laying anchor to go to sleep, for example, if you've got a boat with a cabin. We've also got a depth sounder. So if the depth is changing beneath you, then that's going to indicate that the boat's actually moving. The other two things is we can take several transits if we're close to the shoreline, or take several bearings, or a combination of both. So I'll show you how those work as well. So a transit is when we use 2 different objects on the shore relative to one another to give us an imaginary line. So if you have a look here on the beach, we've got some boulders, some quite big rocks just by the water here, and then just up behind them, see where there's sort of a pair of trees. So if the boat were to go that way, like to a right, then relatively the boulder in the foreground is going to go off to the left, and the gap is going to open out between the boulders and the 2 trees. Now we need to think about which way the boat's going to drift. Normally we'd expect to drift with the wind or with the current, or the combination of the 2. So we want to take a transit that's kind of sideways to the boat. Now in this case, going backwards, we're going to drift in this direction towards these tall trees. So if we were to take a transit in that direction, we might be drifting towards it, but that transit's going to stay the same. So that's not actually very good to tell us that we're holding position. To take a bearing, we're getting a magnetic compass direction to an object on the shore. So you could either use a hand bearing compass, which you might have on a boat. You might have some binoculars that have a compass built into them to show them what direction you're looking at. Or again, if you're on a small boat, even just something like a walking compass will be absolutely fine. That bearing is about 105. So what we'd expect if the boat starts to drift backwards, which is going to be to the right hand side of the screen, then the whole shore in front of us is going to go left and left and left. So actually the bearing in this case is going to get smaller in number. So I've released the anchor now. So if we just keep watching these rocks on the foreshore and then the 2 trees sort of in the background, we're now starting to see the rocks are going to the left compared to the trees. I'm going to recover the anchor now. Now on a small boat, especially in light winds like today, it'd be easy enough just to start pulling the anchor warp, and the boat's just going to move forwards towards the anchor as we bring it in. If there's 2 of you, or in a bigger boat, generally it'd be a good idea for the driver to maneuver the boat towards the anchor to take the load off, to make it easier to pull in. So normally also it's a good idea to get the boat started and make sure the engine's working and everything before pulling in the anchor. But since it's just me and I know the engine's reliable, I'm just going to pull in the warp. once the boat started moving, it's really easy just to keep the momentum on. So first job is to actually release the painter that we tied earlier. From the anchor hook. And then also I want to release this loop that I made because we don't want to get knots in the rope in the locker and we don't need it. Okay, so we're paying the line. Again, we're just flaking it into the locker. So just be careful when you're pulling the rope in. We don't want to drag it too much over the side of the boat because that's going to put wear onto the boat. But also bear in mind that if we're leaning out over the boat too much, that's not necessarily kind of very good for our back, pulling up quite a lot of weight of chain and anchor. So kind of, bit of a compromise. When we get to the chain, obviously this is all being sat on the seabed, so it might be really covered in mud. So at this point, I might just be watching, but I'm giving it a bit of a rinse. I can feel when the anchor's lifted out of the seabed as well. So it's called weighing anchor. It's a process of pulling it in. So what I'm doing, I'm working the anchor up, but I'm not dragging the chain over the side of the boat. So now the anchor's near to the boat, we want to be careful, firstly not to smash the anchor into the boat and damage the boat. Also, I'm just giving it a slosh about in the water for all of the mud to rinse off the anchor, because we don't want to be bringing that horrible stinky mud we get on the seabed into the boat.
There's a chance our anchor could snag on something on the seabed. In this example, it's got caught on a chain and will be hard to release. Most anchors have an attachment point for a tripping line. A tripping line will pull the anchor backwards to release it from where it's got stuck. If there's a fair chance your anchor could get stuck, you should fit a tripping line with a buoy on the end of it. The rope will need to be at least as long as the maximum expected depth, so the buoy can float on the surface. If your anchor gets stuck, you can recover the buoy to pull up the anchor. I've seen suggestions to rig up the anchor like this, tying the chain to the shank of the anchor with cable ties or thin string. The idea is that normally the load will still travel straight along the anchor, but if the anchor gets stuck, the chain will pull away at an angle and release from the shank, becoming the tripping line. However, if the anchor snags in a way that the anchor is still able to move around, like this, there may not be enough sideways force to break the tie-up or string, so it may not release. The other problem is that the wind or tide can cause the boat to swing, and the anchor may release when you don't want it to. The best thing to do is to make a little bit more effort to use a separate tripping line if you think the seabed could be a bit risky, for example if you're anchoring near wrecks. There's no risk of the anchor accidentally releasing, and you can release the anchor with a dedicated tripping line. I hope this has been useful. You might be interested in some of my other boating related videos here.